All right, welcome to my presentation. I am Bailey Calhoun, and I will be covering the economic impacts of the U.S. stimulus packages and Federal Reserve policy in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. To start off, we will overview the COVID-19 economic crisis. So the COVID-19 pandemic led to unprecedented economic disruptions, with businesses closed, unemployment soaring, and the global economy facing a sharp recession due to economic shutdowns. The government and central banks worldwide responded with fiscal and monetary policies to mitigate the economic damage and support recovery. We will be focusing on the U.S.'s response to the pandemic, which consisted of federal government stimulus packages and the Federal Reserve's emergency policies. We will also explore key economic concepts such as economic growth, unemployment, inflation, fiscal and monetary policy, and the federal budget deficit as they relate to the COVID-19 economic crisis. First, we'll look at the business cycle and economic growth as they relate to the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic triggered a severe recession due to business closures, social distancing, and disruptions in supply chains that were related to the COVID shutdowns. The U.S. GDP contracted sharply, with the economy in a downturn in 2020, signaling an urgent need for government intervention to stabilize and stimulate growth. The U.S. real GDP, or gross domestic product adjusted for inflation, fell abruptly to 9% below its level at the start of the pandemic-induced recession. Recovery and relief legislation from the federal government was enacted in March and April of 2020, and the end of the recession came by quarter three of 2020's fiscal year, showing a quick recovery from some of the worst recessionary impacts of the pandemic. Additional legislation was enacted in December 2020 and February 2021, and thus the real GDP of the United States surpassed its pre-recession peak in the first quarter of 2021. We can see here from this graph from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that the trough of the COVID-19 recession was much more severe than the trough of the Great Recession. However, the recovery time from the COVID-19 recession was much quicker, and growth was stronger in the COVID-19 recession compared to the Great Recession. Next, we will look at fiscal policy during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the first federal government relief package came from the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act in March of 2020. This consisted of a $2.2 trillion aid package to stimulate economic growth, including funds to help struggling industries, as well as direct payments of $1,200 per tax filer in the form of direct government transfers. The second round of stimulus packages was passed in December of 2021, which was a $900 billion pandemic relief bill, which funded direct payments of $600 per tax filer, as well as funding for additional grants and aid for industries most affected by the pandemic. Finally, the last round of economic stimulus from the federal government related to the COVID-19 pandemic came from the Biden administration's American Rescue Plan Act in February of 2021. This was a $1.9 trillion aid package, which included funding for state and local governments, as well as a national vaccine and public health jobs programs, and small business grants and loans to support businesses that were struggling due to pandemic-related issues. Additionally, the American Rescue Plan Act provided $1,400 in direct payments per tax filer. These stimulus packages were aimed to boost consumption, prevent mass business closures, and support the healthcare system. Next, we'll look at monetary policy. The Federal Reserve cut interest rates to near zero levels in March of 2020 in response to the pandemic-induced recession. The Fed also purchased nearly $3 trillion of assets, including U.S. Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities, as a form of quantitative easing to stimulate economic activity by increasing the money supply. The Fed also offered emergency lending as the lender of last resort to support struggling businesses and local governments, encouraging further spending and economic activity. The goal was to increase liquidity, stabilize financial markets, and keep borrowing costs low for businesses and consumers. The next concept that we will look at is unemployment. The US unemployment rate reached its peak throughout the pandemic in April 2020 at 14.7%. This was largely due to lockdowns and closures, which led to mass layoffs, particularly in sectors like hospitality, retail, and tourism. Unemployment remained high through 2020, and by 2021, there were still 9 million fewer jobs compared to pre-pandemic levels. Additionally, labor force participation level was 1.9% lower than before the pandemic, showing that the economy had not fully recovered and was not running at full productive efficiency. Fiscal and monetary policy to promote spending and investment aimed to stimulate the economy and increase the demand for employment. We can see through this graph from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics that unemployment spiked and reached its peak during April, and then due to the policies enacted to stimulate the economy, gradually recovered over time. While the fiscal stimulus enacted by the federal government was important for recovery and stimulating economic growth, it also led to high inflation. The fiscal stimulus, particularly the massive government spending, led to an increased demand for goods and services, contributing to higher prices. And by December of 2021, the Federal Reserve recognized that inflation was an urgent risk to economic stability and recovery, and thus by March 2022 began raising the interest rate to curb rising prices. The Consumer Price Index reached a 6.8% increase year over year by December of 2021. The Federal Reserve's monetary stimulus, including quantitative easing and low interest rates, also played a role in increasing the money supply, which exacerbated inflationary pressures. Additionally, supply chain disruptions caused by the pandemic additionally contributed to a shortage of goods and raw materials, which further pushed up inflation. The challenge for policymakers was to balance the need for continued economic recovery without risking the overheating of the economy through persistent inflation. Finally, we will look at the federal budget deficit. From 2019 to 2021, federal spending increased by approximately 50%, mainly due to pandemic-related aid packages. We can see in this chart from the United States Treasury that in 2020, the total deficit reached its peak among recent history. Despite concerns over debt, many economists argued that borrowing was necessary to stabilize the economy, prevent further economic collapse, and avoid long-term scarring of the labor market. The ability of the U.S. to borrow more was supported by its strong fiscal institutions, the central role of the U.S. dollar in global markets, and the Federal Reserve's support for low interest rates. A key concern was the potential for increased government borrowing to crowd out private investment, as government debt issuance can push up interest rates, making it even more expensive for businesses to borrow. However, given the low interest rates and the Federal Reserve's policies, the crowding out effect was considered less of an immediate concern when compared to the necessary recovery measures that were needed to support struggling industries during the COVID pandemic. Long-term economic stability will depend on how the government manages fiscal policies and reduces the deficit once the economy recovers fully. In conclusion, the U.S. fiscal and monetary responses to the COVID-19 pandemic played a crucial role in mitigating the economic fallout, supporting growth, and reducing the worst effects of issues like unemployment. However, these measures also led to significant inflationary pressures and a dramatic increase in the national debt. The challenge moving forward will be managing inflation while sustaining economic growth and addressing long-term fiscal sustainability. Here is a list of my sources, including the sources used for my graphs.